Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening and welcome back to Hilaal Live. My name is Faraz Patel. I'd like to thank you, the viewer, of course, for staying with us. Now, the mining industry in South Africa is going through a turbulent time as some of the major multinational firms have started to shed jobs. ArcelorMittal became the latest to announce this, and this also comes fresh from the tragedy that occurred at Implats in Rustenburg, which saw miners die due to an accident. Now, the job losses are due to demanding commodities and also the power crisis within South Africa, which continues to wreak havoc. Joining me now to unpack this, I'd like to welcome mining analyst Peter Major. Mr. Major, good day and thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Mr. Major, when you see commodity prices really being not just inconsistent, but showing a sense of it really being in the red, that's when you know really that the mining industry in this country is really going through a very difficult time.
Oh, without a doubt, it's the perfect barometer. And these commodity prices, even though they've only reverted to their long-term averages, our mining companies are no longer able to operate like that. We now have high cost, high maintenance mines. They've gone through a real somersault the last 30 years. We no longer have large mining houses that have balance sheets and many different commodity producers. Now our mining companies are standing on their own. They don't have a big brother to lean on. Maybe a few of them do, but most of them don't. They're standing on their own. And what happens when you have high commodity prices, abnormally high prices, just like we did in the late 70s? Now we had it the last 3 years during COVID. Those prices, as they went up, they pulled the costs with them. Labor costs, electricity costs, supplier costs. They dragged all those prices up. But as we know, a commodity price can fall in one day, a week. Well, boy, they have. Just the PGM prices have fallen close to 45, 50% from where they were 12, 15 months ago. But the costs, they're continuing to go up. It's a lot harder bringing down your costs. So now all of a sudden, a lot of our producers, not just the PGMs, but mainly them, are bleeding money. And they don't want to close down. You don't want to lay off any more people than absolutely necessary. But if you bleed to death, you're not helping anybody.
Mr. Major, a couple of months ago, Anglo American announces the possibility, of course, of job cuts. That you're thinking, okay, it's one of those companies, they're having a difficult time, various factors that come into it. Then you have Implats, and then you have Goldfields. And then this week, we have, of course, ArcelorMittal announcing it. The trend has been growing, hasn't it? And when you have these four major mining conglomerates within South Africa announcing this, it's a worrying state of affairs, isn't it?
It's very worrying. And it's all the more reason government has to work in tandem with our mining industry. They have to be friends. And they shouldn't be enemies anyways. You know, government gets its money from companies. People get their jobs from companies. You know, a lot of people work for the government, but where are they getting the money from? It's from the companies. Government takes it from the companies. They pay themselves, their workers. So there's no reason for government to be antagonistic to these companies. There's no good reason for government to take a model that was working very, very well at giving this state tens of billions of dollars worth of taxes year after year. Instead, they've decimated the mining industry. They've thrown on thousands of new policies and regulations, and they've just turned off every foreign investor we ever had, and they've turned off most of our local producers with layer and layer of legislation, policies, and just bureaucracy. And yeah, now these companies, they're stranded, they're bleeding, and they're going to need help, and they need big help. They need help from the employees, the unions, and they really need government to change its attitude and its policies that have put them in this predicament.
Mr. Major, you bring up unions. Now, obviously, the union's job is to be that labor broker between the employees and, of course, the employers and those, of course, sit as board of directors of these mining companies. But we've seen that the relationship, to a certain extent, between unions and mining companies has been a bit fragile. What do unions now need to do to make sure that the further job cuts, and I know a lot of the factors are not in their hands, but what now? What is the role of unions now in trying to make sure this bloodbath of job losses is not further exacerbated?
I believe that unions lost their way a long time ago. Unions were a way of expressing Africans' demand for political recognition, for economic opportunities that were equal to everybody in the country. And that was the only way they could effectively unite here in the 70s and 80s. But what's happened, they've started this momentum and they're unable to adapt. They're unable to change with the times. So even though they're representing the workers, too many of our union leaders had aspirations of becoming billionaires. Too many of them have aspirations of becoming political heavyweights because they've seen their predecessors did that. And so they forgot, what is a union's job? It's not just to protect the jobs of your employees. It should be to grow the number of members you've got. It should be to help companies have avenues to hire more people. But I haven't seen our unions do that. I don't think I've seen a few instances recently, but not enough instances, and too recent. But the majority of these 30 years, it was purely confrontational. That's how union leaders moved up to become billionaires, to become political heavyweights. And so the people coming up behind them, the lower ranks of the union management, they see how it worked for their predecessors. They've done the same. In the meantime, they've now woken up, and the NUM sees, wow, we used to have nearly 500,000 men working on the gold mines. Now we don't even have 70,000 men working on the gold mines. And we used to have 220,000 on the platinum mines. We're down to 160. We had maybe 110,000 on the coal mines. We're down to 80. So they weren't looking after their members' interests. They were looking after their interests. So if they want to do something good for the country and grow their membership, they've got to work in tandem, 50-50 in the middle between their workers and the company, and maybe the government too. They must lobby government. Hey, we need some policies and legislation to bring in foreign investment, not chase it away.
And that's why I want to bring the next question in, Mr. Major. So you've got Gwede Mantashe, who is the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. His history, of course, being a unionist and somebody who still has, if I stand to be corrected, membership within the South African Communist Party. Now, I watched the press conference of his during, of course, the disaster of Implats. And even there, I saw I won't say disconnection, but a bit of a fragility between himself and, of course, the mining bosses. To a certain extent, the buck does stop with him, doesn't it? Because he is, of course, quite senior within this portfolio, actually very senior in this portfolio. And he is, of course, seen as somebody who, at the end of the day, can make these legislative changes in order to accompany the mining companies and, of course, its employees.
Without a doubt. You've said everything that I would have said. Gwede is in the right seat, but he doesn't wear the right hat. He has too many hats. He's a politician personified. He's spending time running around with the Russians. He's spending time running around with the unions. He's spending time on alternative energy, on various mines. He's spending time with the ANC, helping them get elected. And you can't do that. Life is too bloody complicated. It's too competitive. It's too fast. Most of us can barely handle one job with one focus. And he's mining minister. He should be focused on mining. And is mining growing under his watch? Has he been adding jobs from the time he was a union head to the time he's become mining minister, or has the country shed mining jobs. These prices we saw, metal prices that we saw during COVID, they were unimaginable. I'm 68 years old. I could never have imagined these PGM prices. Gold, yeah, maybe I could imagine it, but we saw it. All these metal prices went berserk. We could have made so much money had we had the men and the policies that we'd had even 20 years before. We still made a lot of money, but it was from price movements only. Nobody could increase production because the infrastructure is falling apart because of policy constraints. Hardly any money came in from outside. We should have been sinking shafts left and right, building new plants. No, Gwede has been disastrous as a mining minister. He doesn't know what his priorities are. He has not helped the mining industry.
Mr. Major, one final question. We're going to have blackouts. I don't know till when. Parts of the ANC says that we can end this by the end of the year, but you've got, the Minister of Electricity not really sure when it's going to happen. And you've got a macroeconomic policy that has a huge question mark regarding that. If you are a foreign investor right now, you're looking at South Africa with a lot of concern, aren't you? And that does not bode well for us as a country that really does need injection, especially in an economy where it is a little bit lopsided at this moment. That's a concern, isn't it, Mr. Major?
It's a huge concern because the people at the top do not seem worried about what's happening to the people below them. They don't seem worried what happens to our country here, our wonderful country that was endowed with probably more economic minerals than Russia and America put together. They've taken it for granted. They inherited this gigantic industrial powerhouse, rich beyond imagination with minerals in the ground that have always needed tens of billions of foreign capital to get it out. And if you just look at the president, the prime minister of China, how quick he got on a plane a few weeks ago when the statistics came out that after 30 years of sucking in trillions of dollars in foreign investment, China now is actually paying out more than they're bringing in. And it's not a big amount, but he doesn't want to see China paying out anything more than it coming in. They survived and grew on foreign capital coming in. So that prime minister of China flew to San Francisco to meet with the rich American financiers, saying, gentlemen, we are open for business. Do not take serious some of this negative legislation, some of the things you've heard and read. Please, we want your investment. That's how serious they are about getting foreign investment. But our government seems worried about all kinds of esoteric things all over the world, instead of going out and talking to foreign investors saying, we need you coming back in. You've been exiting for 30 years. We want you to come back in. They don't seem interested in that. They don't seem interested in creating jobs. They can only create jobs and build mines with foreign capital, and they've done everything possible to drive foreign capital out the last 20 years.
Mr. Major, thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live. Much appreciated.
Okay, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. That's Peter Major, a mining analyst. Got to feel it for the 3,500 families that are going to be affected by those job cuts. So, of course, were the breadwinners of ArcelorMittal. It's going to be a very difficult time for them when, of course, those job cuts do occur. Do stay tuned to Hilaal Live. I'll be back after this break.